in contemplating this topic, courage, of course, the first thing I always do, because I'm a nerd, is to go to etymology. And I'm sure everyone here knows that the word courage actually comes from the Latin root cor, for heart, meaning heart. So in my definition, as I looked at those moments in my life that have required great courage, I believe courage really is that which requires your heart to be seen, to take the lead, following our heart, even when it goes against the dominant values around us. But the irony is that so much of the first half of our lives is this kind of elaborate project to hide and protect our hearts. And so I think if we want to tap into the most courageous parts of ourselves, we need to reverse that process. We need to unhinder our sensitivity so that we can come back into connection, which is necessary if we're going to perceive and attend to the world around us. So in my book, Belonging, I decided to come up with a new word for this particular flavor of work. So I invented the word vulnerabravery. Vulnerabravery. So instead of putting up our defenses when we meet with conflict, vulnerabravery is the conscious choice to keep our hearts open so that we can discover what's hidden within hardship. And I think it's a great paradox that when we let ourselves be undefended, we actually find our truest strength. So yeah, I think at this point we're all aware, especially if you're attending this gathering, that our species is standing on this very dangerous precipice. And not just our species, of course, but planetarily speaking, collapse is happening on all fronts at this time on Earth. Ecological, ideological, social, political. But I believe we humans have everything we need to remake the world. We have the technology, we have the creativity, we have the vision. So what is it that is prohibiting us from realizing that vision? T.S. Eliot has this wonderful poem, and one of the stanzas in the poem, maybe you're familiar with it, is between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act falls the shadow. Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. So while we may have this idea in our hearts for how the world could be, how the world should be, we can't realize it without first passing through the valley of the shadow. And this means looking, I think, at the origins of our original estrangement, what brought us to a place of alienation. And this happens at three levels. It happens in our personal lives, there's the cultural estrangement, and then of course the ancestral, which is when those traumas and wounds metastasize through the generations. Those are original displacements, those original alienations, those original disconnections from place, from culture, from togetherness. So, but I think it's overwhelming and maybe even impossible for any individual to begin to know how to fix the world when we approach it as a whole. But if we begin thinking as an ecosystem, as constituents of a larger whole, that's when things begin to feel manageable, approachable. You know, there's this old hermetic adage, as above, so below, as within, so without. And there's great wisdom in this old saying, because collapse, you know, as Michelle pointed out, collapse isn't just happening on this grand stage. It's also happening in our individual lives, whether that looks like illness, loss of identity, or relational loss and fracturing, which we've seen an enormous amount of during the pandemic in the last few years, social fracturing. And this isn't a coincidence, right? Because the world is truly fractal in nature. What's going on those larger scales is condensed and reiterated on smaller scales. Your life is a microcosm of that larger whole. You know, we find this patterning phenomenon in the rest of nature. We see these symmetries in the branching of trees that, like fractals, they grow in self-similar reiterations. So what I mean by that is you can measure the space between the branches of a tree and find those same ratios in the twigs on each branch, but you can also find it in the forest. The distribution of large branches to smaller branches is reiterated fractally in the larger forest. And we see this amazing phenomenon of patterns of fractals all over nature. We see it in the spiral, the mighty spiral, which you see in the nautilus shell, but you also see in the head of a sunflower, in spiral galaxies, so at that very large scale as well, or even in the twirling growth of plants. So we find these universal patterns at different levels and scales throughout the living biosphere. So my question is, why shouldn't they also be found in the ecosystem of psyche, in the ecosystem of our stories? I think when you distill what is similar in this shadow valley for all of us, that we have to overcome, that we have to pass through, is this, at the most intimate level, the belief that we don't matter, that we don't matter. And that's the piece we have to overcome. You know, matter, nerding out again here with etymology, comes from the Latin for mother, mater, mother, or materia, which means substance. The substance, the mother from which we come. So our belief, I think, that we don't matter actually comes from that core feeling of disconnection that we have from the Great Mother, which of course is the earth, our first substance. And it's our sense and practice of interconnectedness, what Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully called interbeing, that makes us cheerfully responsible for the earth and all its inhabitants. That sense of connectedness is what gives us a sense of responsibility. It is what calls us to serve in some tangible way with our lives, that larger body that we are dependent upon and connected to, and embedded in. And so when we don't have that, the natural result is a feeling of expendability. And we feel that way about these so-called resources of the earth, expendable, because of that disconnection. But so too, that feeling of expendability lives in the deepest valley of our personal shadow. You know, you really dig into the place where most people suffer. It's this feeling of, I don't matter, I'm expendable. So why should I do anything? other than just get along. Carl Jung has this great quote, which I dug out: bitterness and wisdom form a pair of alternatives. Bitterness and wisdom form a pair of alternatives. Where there is bitterness, wisdom is lacking, and where wisdom is, there can be no bitterness. So bitterness and wisdom form a pair of alternatives. Where there is bitterness, wisdom is lacking. Where there is wisdom, there can be no bitterness. And I think this is really true. So I think in disorienting times, when you lose sight of your own horizon, your goals often shrink to those more humble efforts to just put one foot in front of the other, to make it through the night, to just stay alive, or to find a solid ground again. Even as we tell each other stories of heroic transformation and overcoming, and we summon the reserves to keep pushing, powering through, still there might be a fragile voice inside all of that heroic effort, which says, but what if I don't transform? What if there is no butterfly, right? And so when people speak of that chrysalis of transformation, I think we take comfort in the idea that there is an other side to emerge on. However, especially with things like chronic illness and profound grief, and even with trauma patterns that have been, compounded through generations, it can feel as if years pass and you can still find yourself in that sense of injury and loneliness. And that's when we're susceptible to bitterness. It develops out of that growing doubt that any good will come out of this hardship. And I think we can feel that on a planetary scale as well. And that voice of doubt is pernicious because it haunts the person who is unable to escape injury. When your footing is lost and everything is turned upside down, nothing is where it used to be. And the predicament that you're in never seems to end. When you've dropped the thread of your own story and your pattern has become broken and disorganized, what you're really experiencing is a loss of wisdom. And so this is where courage comes in for me, because I think what we have to do is to be able to sift through the rubble of everything that has collapsed in our personal lives and find what remains. Even if it's one thing, one small thing, what hints at new life? What enlivens and stirs our heart out of bitterness? Even when that vitality is faint or near invisible and it's easy to dismiss, we have to find ways to give it relevance. We have to find ways to venerate it, to follow it, to aggrandize it. And I think of that, if you know the ethnobotanist and psychonaut the great Terence McKenna, he has this wonderful quote you've probably come across: nature loves courage. Nature loves courage. You make the commitment, and nature responds by removing impossible obstacles. You make the commitment, and nature responds by removing impossible obstacles. This is how magic is done, by hurling yourself into the abyss to discover it's a feather bed. And but it's the magic part of this quote that I really want to focus on. Magic is the recognition of the world, of reality, as being a participatory process in which we must be engaged. So instead of giving into bitterness, we have to revive our imaginal capacity. So as some of you may know, or as Michelle said in my intro, I'm a dream worker. So I help people understand their dreams. I help people, I sort of midwife the wisdom that's coming through in other people's dreams. And I try to teach people how to understand the language of dreams, which is possible, believe it or not. And a huge part of that is being able to penetrate our tendency to rationalism, which really muffles the other part of our capacity, which is this imaginal capacity that I'm mentioning. And it's tricky because I think for us in Western culture, at least, there is a tendency to malign those words, dreamy and illusory, like imaginary. We think of these things as synonymous and are quite dismissive with those words. But in the Sufi tradition, the imaginal world, which is alam malakut, is understood to be a world which is an intermediate dimension between physical reality and spiritual reality. And in this interdimensional world, one can travel to that place between matter and spirit. And so this is the place where mystics and shamans travel in order to make contact with the living wisdom of the earth, the anima mundi, the soul of the world, in order to retrieve healing for individuals and for communities and for ourselves. And so when we tend to our dreams, we are reaching towards that wisdom. And she reaches back to us in the form of novel images, images that carry meaning, new forms of meaning that bring our story forward, that move us out of those recurring loops and habitual behaviors, help us to expand, sort of like a spiral garden in ever widening spirals of psychic growth. And it's here that we find not only clues, structured clues to our own unfoldment, but to the healing potential for the earth as well. So before I end here, I just wanted to share a dream that I had recently with you because it was so moving and intriguing, and absolutely did not come from my own knowing, because it taught me something. And that's how you know that dreams come from a larger intelligence, or what I call wisdom, sometimes referred to as Sophia. So in the dream, an elder who I cherish and admire very much gifted me a first edition novel from his collection of antiquities. And it was dated in the Middle Ages. And the book was extremely rare by a well-known author, and it was thick with history. And as I held the book in my hands for the first time, I understood that its value was not just who the author was and how, historical the book was, but also, or even, how the book was sewn and bound in the materials of, the 1400s. But it was also in how the book was ruined. Because as I flipped through the pages, my mentor pointed out places where someone had spilled wax, where some of the pages were folded and even torn from improper care over the centuries. And I understood that these injuries in and of themselves were what gave the book true value. But then, as I moved towards the back of the pages, I found a chunk of pages in the book where a hole had been born right through a chunk of pages, kind of like some sort of external injury. And I could even see the confetti of the pages as they dissolved. You know how dreams defy physical limitations. So I could even see, you know, the shredding of those pages in some other dimensional memory. But here's the thing, when I looked into the gash in the pages, when I looked through, I could see green. And I understood in a sudden awareness that I could see the trees from which the paper was made. So I think one of the profound teachings of this dream, and perhaps we can hold this in our hearts as we explore this very difficult topic, fractally, both considering the losses that we have sustained in our very personal lives, and also the losses that we're seeing on extraordinary levels in the world, is to remember the value of decomposition. Chaos and decomposition are prerequisite for transformation. All great things came out of collapse. Acorns open in forest fires, fallen trees become the nurse logs for new sprouts. Compost is the feast upon which new life thrives. And the image that comes to mind for me always is the image of Ouroboros, which is the snake that's eating its tail. And amazingly, this is an archetypal image that is found in many different cultures and continents around the world throughout time in slightly different iterations. So the form changes, but the philosophy doesn't. And the philosophy underneath it, the meaning underneath this image, is that all of nature is in a continuous cycle of creation and destruction. The beginning is embedded in the end. At any given time, we are either composing or dismantling the forms and the stories that make up our lives, sometimes both at once, right? So the beginning is embedded in the end. So that's that sifting through the rubble to see what remains, what spark of new life exists here, and how can I aggrandize it? How can I venerate it? How can I follow it? You know, when a story that we are telling about our lives becomes old, we feel a sense of ennui about its repetitiveness. I'm sure you've had this experience at one point in your life or not. But you know, you may be sort of telling somebody for the umpteenth time about this terrible thing that happened to you, and suddenly you hear this weird echo in your own voice, maybe a sort of disembodied feeling that you're speaking from a kind of script that has lost its meaning. And this is how we know that it's ready to be composted, sent back to the primordial soil to fertilize a new story sprout. There is tremendous creative energy that's made available in the death of a story. And I think that was the wisdom of my dream. The green inside the gash is a living portal into the story's origin, right? So only when the trees were shredded into pulp to make the paper on which the story was written, now the story decomposes and we can see the green vitality of source again. This is why wisdom appears in times of anguish. It is in these turning points when she is most visible. It's like that rending between the worlds. She descends to us, sometimes in powerful synchronicities, sometimes in a moving dream, sometimes in a new and unusual image, sometimes in the form of a person or idea that appears unprompted, so-called, into our lives to change the way that we are walking. And she appears to us in this way to say, keep going. Not only is there more to your story beyond this anguish, but one day your story will become the guiding starlight to draw someone else out of their own darkness. And so I guess the idea that I want to leave you with today, and thank you so much for listening to my treatise on finding courage, and I hope it touched something true for you, that our stories are the stories of the ecosystem. You matter. They matter. And it's up to us to notice where we are reproducing mimetic forms of the culture, repetitive ideas, inherited images and concepts from the culture, or past generations, or even our own history. It's up to us to notice where we are repeating those memes. And also to keep our hearts open, vulnerable bravery, to feel for where new life wants to sprout through us into the making of a new world, one individual at a time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Toko-pa. I really resonated with the image of when stories decompose, a portal opens up where we can go to the origin. And what are the truer stories that are being born? What's the new story of health that we need? We're in such a crisis. The planet is in such a crisis. Something went terribly wrong with our, as you said, the patterning, the patternings are changing in our psyche in the world. What's the story that is more aligned, and a relationship with health that is built on the intelligence of interbeing, on the intelligence of interconnectedness. Health that we return as something that comes from the earth, is sustained by the earth, rather than thinking of it in this siloed way.